Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Economics channel. Tonight we follow a single thread, literally, as it winds from a shepherd's hillside to the counting houses of medieval Europe, because tonight's story is the history of the wool and textile trade. For most of human history, cloth was not something you simply bought. It was something entire towns were built around, something kings taxed, something wars were quietly financed by. Before there were stock markets, before there were central banks, there was wool, sheared, carded, spun, woven, dyed, and carried across oceans and mountain passes by people who understood, long before economists gave it a name, that thread could become wealth. Civilizations rose on the backs of sheep. Trust between strangers was built one bolt of cloth at a time, and the patience required to grow, gather, and weave fiber into fortune shaped how entire societies thought about time, value, and each other. If you're enjoying these long, slow walks through economic history, consider leaving the video a quiet like, subscribing for more, or leaving a comment about which era you'd like visited next. It helps this channel more than you might think, though there's no pressure at all tonight. For now, let your shoulders soften into whatever you're resting on. Let your breathing slow, unhurried, natural. Let your thoughts loosen the way wool loosens under a comb, fiber by fiber, until there is nothing left to hold on to but the sound of this story. Let's begin. A wild sheep in the hills of ancient Anatolia carried, without knowing it, the seed of an entire global economy. Around 10,000 years ago, early herders began keeping sheep not just for meat, but for something new, a soft undercoat that could be pulled, then later sheared and twisted into thread. Fossilized dyed fibers found in ancient caves suggest people were coloring cloth almost as soon as they could make it. The tension is that wool, unlike grain, could not simply be stored and eaten in a hungry winter. It had to be turned into something else first, or it was worthless. Even in that earliest moment, value depended on patience, on the willingness to wait for raw material to become something more. Long before anyone minted a coin, a spindle turning in someone's hand was quietly building the first economy. Archaeologists have found small stone and clay spindle whorls scattered across Neolithic villages, simple weighted discs that let a single thread be twisted evenly for hours at a time. A skilled spinner could produce enough thread in a season to clothe a family, but rarely much more. Production was slow, and every extra bolt of cloth represented real, hard-won hours. This is what makes early textile history so quietly remarkable. Long before anyone wrote a word about economics, ordinary hands were already learning the deepest lesson of it, that time itself is a kind of currency. Two rival fibers once competed for the loyalty of the ancient world, and their rivalry shaped where civilizations grew rich. In the river valleys of Egypt, flax thrived in the damp soil, spun into fine linen that stayed cool in desert heat, while further north and east, wool suited colder climates and became the fabric of choice for herding peoples. Neither fiber ever fully displaced the other, and the tension between them quietly shaped trade routes for millennia, as regions specialized in whichever fiber their land favored. Geography, in this way, wrote the first chapter of the textile economy, long before any merchant ever did. Imagine standing in a Sumerian courtyard nearly 5,000 years ago, watching scribes press reed styluses into wet clay, counting not coins but bundles of wool. In the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, wool was one of the very first goods ever tracked in written records, logged onto clay tablets alongside grain and livestock. because temples and palaces needed to know exactly how much cloth their workshops were producing. These early administrators faced a real problem: thousands of spinners and weavers working under one roof, and no simple way to measure fairness or output. In solving it, they accidentally invented something larger than they knew: the written record of economic life itself. A temple workshop in ancient Ur could employ hundreds of women spinning and weaving wool at once, making it one of the first large-scale industries in human history. Records suggest these workshops produced enormous quantities of cloth, some of it kept for local use and much of it sent outward, traded for timber, metal, and stone that Mesopotamia's flat river plains simply did not have. The tension is a familiar one even now. The region's soil grew barley and supported sheep beautifully, but nearly everything else had to come from somewhere else. Wool became the bridge across that gap, a soft, humble fiber, quietly financing an entire civilization's hunger for what it could not grow itself. Before there were coins stamped with a ruler's face, a length of woven cloth could buy almost anything a person needed. In many early Bronze Age economies, standardized bolts of wool cloth functioned as a kind of currency, exchanged for grain, metal, or labor. Their value understood well enough that merchants carried cloth the way later traders would carry silver. Yet cloth as currency had a real weakness. It could fray, fade, or be damaged by damp, unlike metal that simply sat and waited. Every civilization that leaned on wool as money was, in its own quiet way, gambling that trust could be woven as tightly as thread. A single dye vat in the ancient world could turn an ordinary garment into a symbol of unreachable wealth. Purple dye extracted from a small sea snail found along the eastern Mediterranean coast required thousands of crushed shells to color even a modest length of cloth, making the resulting fabric so costly that only royalty could reasonably afford it. The tension here is stark. An entire coastline's worth of tiny creatures gave their lives for a color, and the labor involved made that color a badge of power long before anyone called it fashion. Even now, the word we use for that royal color still echoes the coastline where it was first pulled from the sea. In the highlands of what is now Peru, weavers were building an economy out of thread thousands of years before any European ship reached their shores. Andean societies developed extraordinarily fine textile traditions using the wool of alpacas and llamas, weaving cloth so intricate that some pieces functioned as records of status, lineage, and even historical memory, stored not in writing but in pattern and knot. The tension is one of loss, because these societies developed largely apart from the Old World's trade networks. Their innovations in fiber and dye remained, for centuries, unknown beyond their own mountains. It is a gentle reminder that wealth built from cloth grew independently in more places than any single history usually remembers. A merchant walking into an early Bronze Age market would have judged a person's worth partly by the weave of their sleeve. Fine, tightly spun wool cloth took far longer to produce than coarse cloth, and that extra labor time was visible to anyone who looked closely, making clothing itself an early, unspoken signal of a household's wealth and free time. The tension is one that still lingers in every era since, even when no one intends it. The things people wear quietly announce how much of their life they could afford to spend on appearances. Cloth, in this way, became one of humanity's first languages of status, spoken in fiber rather than words. By the time the first true trade caravans crossed the ancient Near East, bundles of wool cloth already rode alongside grain and copper as one of the most dependable goods to carry. Unlike food, cloth did not spoil quickly, and unlike raw metal ore, it was light enough for a single donkey to carry a season's worth of value across hundreds of miles of open desert. The tension was theft and banditry, a constant shadow over any caravan carrying something so easily resold, which is part of why merchants so often traveled together, trusting safety in numbers more than in any single guard. Long before banks existed to protect wealth, camel trains and careful company were the only insurance a merchant had. Along the banks of the Nile, an entire administrative machine grew up around counting bolts of linen rather than coins of gold. Ancient Egyptian scribes tracked cloth production in careful lists because linen functioned as a form of payment for laborers, including, according to surviving records, workers who built the great monuments of the pharaohs. The tension is one of scale. Feeding and clothing thousands of workers required an enormous, coordinated textile output, run almost like a state industry centuries before the word industry existed. It is a strange, quiet thought that some of the most famous structures on Earth were raised, in part, on wages paid in woven cloth. Egyptian linen was so finely woven that some surviving fragments are almost transparent, thin enough to read through even after thousands of years in the sand. Skilled Egyptian weavers achieved thread counts that would remain difficult to match for millennia, spinning flax so evenly that the resulting cloth could be folded into pleats fine enough for royal fashion. Yet this quality came at a real human cost and time. A single fine garment could represent weeks of patient, repetitive labor by spinners whose names history never recorded. Their skill outlived them by thousands of years, even as their identities quietly slipped away. Across the Mediterranean, Roman households ran on a domestic textile economy that modern people would barely recognize as an economy at all. In many Roman homes, spinning wool was considered a core duty even for women of high status, a symbol of virtue so strong that some tombstones proudly noted that the deceased had spun wool diligently throughout her life. The tension is a subtle one. This same domestic labor, framed as moral virtue, was also simply unpaid economic production. Cloth made at home instead of purchased at market. Virtue and value, it turns out, have often been woven from the very same thread. Rome's appetite for fine cloth eventually pulled silk all the way from the far edge of Asia, along a route so long that no single merchant ever walked its entire length. Roman writers complained that silk garments, imported at enormous cost, drained the empire's silver reserves, even as demand for the shimmering fabric only grew among the wealthy of the capital. The tension is an old one, repeated in nearly every era since. A taste for imported luxury quietly reshaping a nation's balance of trade, long before anyone used that phrase. Even a great empire, it turned out, could be nudged off balance by nothing heavier than thread. A single Roman wool cloak, dyed a deep and lasting color, could cost more than a soldier's wages for an entire year. Certain dyes, particularly the rich purples reserved for senators and emperors, were protected by law, with sumptuary regulations restricting who was even permitted to wear them, regardless of wealth. The tension is that cloth had become more than clothing. It had become a legal marker of rank, policed as carefully as any other symbol of power. In a society built on visible hierarchy, thread and dye quietly did work that armies and titles alone could not. Roman wool did not stay in Rome. It traveled outward along roads built for legions, but used just as often by merchants carrying bolts of finished cloth. Regional textile centers grew up across the empire, from Gaul to North Africa, each developing its own reputation for particular weaves, weights, or dyes, feeding a genuinely interconnected Mediterranean cloth market. The tension came when that empire eventually strained and fractured, and the long, dependable roads that carried cloth safely for centuries slowly grew less safe, less maintained, less certain. Trade routes, it turns out, are rarely destroyed all at once. They simply fade, the way a well-worn path disappears once fewer feet walk it. In the wool markets of the ancient world, weight itself was often the simplest, most honest measure of value a stranger could trust. Long before uniform coinage spread everywhere, wool and cloth were frequently weighed and measured by standardized units, giving buyers and sellers who spoke different languages and served different rulers a shared, physical way to agree on worth. The tension is that standards varied from region to region, and a merchant crossing a border often had to relearn, city by city, exactly what a fair measure looked like. Trust in that world had to be renegotiated at almost every single crossing. Sheep herding shaped the rhythm of entire ancient societies, dictating when families moved, where they settled, and how their year was divided. Transhumance, the seasonal movement of flocks between lowland winter pastures and highland summer grazing, became a defining pattern of life across much of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, timed as precisely as any modern calendar. The tension is that this rhythm left little room for improvisation. A bad grazing season could ripple forward for years, thinning flocks and, with them, the cloth and income an entire community depended on. Wealth built on living animals has always carried a fragility that wealth built on stone or metal never quite shares. A Phoenician trading ship setting out from the coast of the eastern Mediterranean often carried purple-dyed wool cloth as its single most valuable cargo. Phoenician merchants built a trading network stretching from their home ports to colonies as far as the western Mediterranean, and their skill in dyeing and weaving cloth became inseparable from their reputation as history's earliest true long-distance traders. The tension was distance itself. Every voyage risked storm, piracy, and months of uncertainty, all gambled against the hope that cloth would fetch a fair price at journey's end. Long before insurance existed as an idea, every sail that left port was itself a quiet act of faith. Not every ancient economy prized wool equally, and the differences reveal how deeply geography shaped human habits. In parts of India and later China, cotton and silk took the roles that wool played in Europe and the Near East, each region developing entirely separate traditions of spinning, weaving, and dyeing, suited to its own climate and crops. The tension, seen from a wide enough distance, is really no tension at all, but a kind of quiet parallel invention. Different peoples, unaware of one another, solving the same human problem of covering and adorning the body. This is what makes early textile history so hauntingly universal. Nearly everywhere humans settled, someone eventually learned to turn fiber into fortune. Rome's decline did not silence the textile trade so much as scatter it, sending old skills outward into smaller, regional hands. As centralized imperial markets weakened, local monasteries, estates, and small workshops across post-Roman Europe increasingly took over cloth production, preserving techniques of spinning, weaving, and dyeing, even as the great trade roads grew quieter. The tension is that quality and consistency suffered without the old empire's networks, and for a time, cloth production in much of Europe became smaller, more local, more uneven than it had been for centuries. Yet the knowledge itself did not vanish. It simply waited, patiently, for new roads to be built. Somewhere in ancient China, according to enduring legend, an empress noticed a cocoon fall into her tea and unraveled a fiber so fine it would eventually reshape world trade. Whatever its true origin, silk production in ancient China became a closely guarded craft, involving the careful cultivation of silkworms on mulberry leaves, and a spinning process so delicate that the technique remained a state secret for centuries. The tension is that secrecy itself became valuable. Smuggling silkworm eggs or spinning knowledge out of China was treated as a serious offense because an entire region's economic advantage depended on nobody else learning how it was done. Few industries in history have guarded their knowledge as fiercely or profited from that secrecy as long. The road that carried silk westward was never really one road at all, but a shifting web of paths, oases, and mountain passes. Merchants along what later became known as the Silk Road rarely traveled its entire length themselves, instead passing goods from trader to trader across a relay of regional markets stretching from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean world. The tension was uncertainty at every link in that chain. A single unstable kingdom, a closed mountain pass, or a disrupted oasis town could quietly choke off trade for merchants thousands of miles away who never even knew the cause. Wealth, carried this way, depended on the goodwill and stability of strangers a trader would never meet. Imagine a caravan resting at dusk beside a Central Asian oasis, camels kneeling in the sand, their packs heavy with silk, bound for markets they will never personally reach. These way stations, often modest towns built entirely around trade, grew wealthy simply by feeding, housing, and taxing merchants passing through, turning geography itself into a reliable source of income. The tension is that this wealth was entirely dependent on traffic continuing to flow. A war, a plague, or a diverted route elsewhere could empty a prosperous oasis town within a single generation. Fortune, built on a crossroads, has always been as fragile as the road itself. Silk reached Roman markets so diluted by distance and middlemen that hardly anyone in Rome could have named the country it truly came from. Each stage of the Silk Road added its own markup, its own risk premium, its own local tax, so that by the time a bolt of silk reached the Mediterranean, its price bore little resemblance to what a Chinese producer had originally received. The tension reveals something timeless about long trade chains. Value multiplies with every hand it passes through, often for reasons that have nothing to do with the good itself. Distance, it turns out, has always been one of history's quietest and most persistent taxes. Not everything moving along the Silk Road was silk at all. Wool, too, traveled these ancient roads, carried in the opposite direction from the fine cloth heading west. Nomadic peoples across the Central Asian steppe produced wool and felted goods well suited to their herding lifestyle, trading these westward-bound goods for silk, tea, and manufactured items moving the other way along the same shared paths. The tension between settled weavers and nomadic herders was a constant undertone of steppe history, two very different economies depending on one another even as their ways of life remained worlds apart. Trade, in this sense, has always been a quiet negotiation between people who otherwise had little reason to trust each other. Felt, a humble fabric made by matting wool fibers together rather than weaving them, became one of the steppe world's most practical inventions. Nomadic peoples across Central Asia relied on felt for tents, clothing, and bedding, prizing it precisely because it required no loom, no fixed workshop, and no permanent settlement. Only wool, water, and patient pressure. The tension is a philosophical one as much as an economic one. Felt represents an entirely different relationship with wealth than woven cloth, portable rather than precious, practical rather than prestigious. Not every civilization measured cloth wealth the same way, and the steppe world quietly proves it. By the early medieval period, Byzantine weavers in Constantinople had managed to smuggle silkworm cultivation out of China's tightly guarded reach, forever changing the balance of the silk trade. According to long-standing tradition, monks carried silkworm eggs hidden inside hollow walking canes back to the Byzantine court, allowing the empire to begin producing its own silk, rather than depending entirely on distant Chinese suppliers. The tension is that this single act of quiet industrial espionage reshaped centuries of trade balance, as Byzantium slowly grew into a silk producer in its own right rather than merely a buyer. Sometimes, an entire economic order can pivot on something as small as 2 hollow canes. Byzantine silk workshops eventually became so significant to the empire's finances that silk production itself was placed under close imperial control. Certain grades and colors of silk cloth were reserved exclusively for the imperial court, with strict regulations determining who could produce, sell, or wear the finest fabrics, turning cloth quality into a direct extension of political authority. The tension is one familiar across many empires. When a resource becomes valuable enough, rulers tend to tighten their grip on it, transforming a craft into a controlled instrument of state power. Even thread, it seems, has rarely stayed entirely free from the reach of a throne. As centuries passed, silk slowly stopped being an exotic Chinese secret and became, instead, a shared craft practiced from Byzantium to Persia to parts of the Islamic world. Persian and later Islamic textile centers developed their own celebrated traditions of silk and fine wool weaving, blending patterns and techniques from across a wide trading world into distinctive regional styles admired far beyond their own borders. The tension, softened by time, is simply this: knowledge that begins as a jealously guarded secret rarely stays hidden forever, no matter how carefully an empire tries to protect it. This is what makes the long story of silk so quietly satisfying. A secret guarded for centuries eventually became, patiently and gradually, a gift shared across an entire connected world. By the 12th century, a damp, unremarkable stretch of land along the North Sea had quietly become the beating heart of European cloth production. Flanders, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Belgium, lacked rich farmland or valuable mines, but its towns discovered something more durable, a genius for turning raw wool into some of the finest woven cloth in the known world. The tension is that Flanders produced almost none of the raw wool it needed, forcing its weavers to depend entirely on imported fleece from elsewhere to keep their looms running. A region with barely any sheep of its own became, improbably, the cloth capital of medieval Europe. Imagine the narrow streets of a Flemish town like Ghent or Bruges, air thick with the smell of wet wool and dye, looms clattering behind nearly every doorway. Entire urban populations organized their lives around textile production, with households often specializing in a single stage of the process, one family carding, another spinning, another weaving, another finishing the cloth before it ever reached a merchant's hands. The tension is how fragile this specialization made ordinary lives. A disruption at any single stage, a shortage of dye, a delay in raw wool could leave entire households with no income at all. Prosperity, built this finely divided, was efficient, but it was never entirely safe. Flemish weavers needed a steady, reliable supply of raw wool, and they found it, again and again, from the rolling hills of England. English wool, particularly from certain favored regions, earned a reputation across medieval Europe for its exceptional softness and length of fiber, making it the preferred raw material for Flanders' most prized and expensive cloth. The tension is one of dependency stretched across the sea. An entire Flemish industry's fortunes rose and fell with English wool harvests, English politics, and English willingness to keep exporting their finest fleece. Two distant economies in this way became bound together as tightly as any single length of thread. English wool did not simply drift toward Flanders on its own. It traveled through the hands of merchants who understood exactly how valuable that dependency made them. Wool merchants, some of them extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of their age, built fortunes buying raw fleece across English counties and shipping it to hungry Flemish and later Italian weaving centers. The tension is that this trade made these merchants targets, both of royal taxation eager to skim a share of such profitable commerce, and of resentment from those who felt the wool trade enriched a few at everyone else's expense. Wealth built on a single crucial export has always drawn both admiration and suspicion in roughly equal measure. England's kings learned early that they did not need to grow rich from wool directly, only to tax the wool that others grew rich from. Royal customs duties on wool exports became one of the English crown's most dependable sources of income for centuries, funding everything from castle building to the machinery of war, simply by charging merchants for the right to ship fleece abroad. The tension is that this made the crown's finances quietly dependent on the health of an industry it did not directly control, vulnerable to bad harvests, disrupted trade, or foreign wars beyond its reach. A kingdom, it turns out, can be financed as much by sheep as by soldiers. The wool sack became such a powerful symbol of England's economic foundation that a literal bag of wool was placed in the seat of judgment in the nation's highest chamber. The presiding officer of the House of Lords sat, quite literally, upon a large cushioned sack of wool, a physical reminder to every lawmaker of exactly which industry underpinned the kingdom's prosperity. The tension, softened into tradition over centuries, is really a kind of quiet honesty. Few nations have ever been so openly willing to seat their power directly atop the source of their wealth. Even now, that same wool sack sits in the chamber, a memory stitched into the very furniture of government. Bruges, perched along a navigable waterway to the sea, grew into one of medieval Europe's greatest trading cities, largely on the strength of cloth and the finance built around it. Merchants from across Europe gathered in Bruges to trade wool, finished cloth, and increasingly, the financial instruments needed to move goods and credit safely across long distances, making the city as much a banking center as a marketplace. The tension is that such prosperity depended entirely on the harbor staying open and navigable, a fact the city eventually could not control, as silt slowly reshaped the coastline over generations. Even the busiest ports, it turns out, can be quietly undone by nothing more dramatic than drifting sand. In the great cloth halls of Flemish towns, merchants and buyers gathered to inspect, measure, and negotiate over bolts of woven fabric stacked floor to ceiling. These cloth halls, some grand enough to double as symbols of civic pride, functioned as the medieval equivalent of a stock exchange, a fixed location where standardized quality checks and public trading gave buyers confidence in goods they could not personally trace back to a single weaver. The tension is that reputation, once damaged, was brutally hard to repair. A single scandal involving stretched or adulterated cloth could tarnish an entire town's name in markets hundreds of miles away. Trust, in medieval cloth trading, traveled exactly as far and as fast as a merchant's word. Flemish weavers organized themselves into guilds, associations that controlled who could practice a craft, how it must be done, and what quality standards had to be met. Guild membership offered real protection, guaranteeing weavers a measure of security, training, and collective bargaining power that an individual working alone could never achieve against wealthy merchant buyers. The tension is that guilds could also be rigid and exclusionary, controlling entry so tightly that outsiders, women, and the poor often found themselves shut out of the very trade that shaped their entire town's economy. Protection and exclusion in the guild system were very often two sides of the very same cloth. The relationship between Flemish weavers and the merchants who sold their cloth was rarely an equal one, and tension between labor and capital simmered for generations. Weavers depended on merchants for raw wool and for access to distant markets, while merchants depended on weavers' skill, creating a relationship of mutual need that nonetheless tilted, again and again, toward whoever controlled the money and the trade routes. The tension occasionally boiled over into open unrest, as Flemish textile workers periodically rose up against merchant elites and unfavorable trading terms, disputes that could shake entire towns for months. Even in an age without the word labor dispute, the underlying grievance was already achingly familiar. Political power in Flanders became so entangled with the wool trade that disruptions to cloth commerce could shift the fate of entire counties. Conflicts between England and France periodically threatened to cut off the flow of English wool to Flemish weavers, forcing Flemish rulers into careful, sometimes reluctant diplomacy, simply to keep their region's looms supplied and its people employed. The tension is a lesson repeated throughout economic history. When a region's prosperity depends heavily on a single foreign supply line, its politics inevitably bend to protect that lifeline, whatever the cost to old loyalties. This is what makes the story of Flanders so quietly instructive. An entire region's independence was, in a very real sense, woven from imported thread. By the height of the medieval period, Flemish cloth was recognized and sought after from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, carried by merchants who understood exactly what quality and reputation were worth. Certain towns became so associated with specific grades and colors of cloth that buyers across Europe could request Ghent cloth or a particular Flemish dye shade with confidence, much the way a modern buyer might trust a well-known brand. The tension is that such reputations, built patiently over generations, could be undone remarkably quickly by war, plague, or shifting trade routes that redirected wool and buyers elsewhere. Fame built on cloth, however widespread, has never been quite as permanent as it felt at the time. Flanders' golden age of cloth was never guaranteed to last, and by the later medieval period, cracks were already beginning to show beneath the prosperity. Rising competition from English and Italian weavers, who increasingly began finishing their own cloth rather than exporting raw wool, slowly chipped away at the advantage Flanders had enjoyed for so long as Europe's premier weaving region. The tension is one of quiet irony. The very supply chain that made Flanders rich, English wool flowing outward, eventually taught England's own weavers everything they needed to compete directly. Even the most prosperous industries, history suggests, rarely stay unchallenged for very long. As Flanders' advantage slowly eroded, England quietly stopped being content to simply export raw fleece and began weaving its own future instead. Beginning in the 14th century, English rulers actively encouraged domestic cloth production, inviting skilled Flemish weavers to settle in England and share techniques that had once been closely guarded across the sea. The tension is one of calculated risk. England was gambling that building its own finishing industry would prove more profitable than simply taxing raw wool exports, even if it meant competing directly with its former trading partners. Sometimes the surest path to prosperity is learning to keep, rather than simply sell, your own raw material. To manage the enormously lucrative wool export trade, English authorities created a system known as the staple, funneling nearly all wool exports through a small number of officially designated towns. Merchants trading through the staple gained guaranteed access to markets and legal protection, but in exchange, the Crown could closely monitor and tax the flow of wool leaving the country, turning trade regulation into a dependable stream of royal income. The tension is that concentrating trade this tightly created enormous power for the small circle of merchants licensed to participate, a group that grew extraordinarily wealthy while smaller traders found themselves locked out entirely. Regulation, even when designed for order, has always tended to reward whoever is already standing closest to the gate. The merchants of the staple became some of the wealthiest private citizens in medieval England, their fortunes built almost entirely on control of a single, carefully managed export. These merchants often lent substantial sums directly to the English crown, financing royal wars and ambitions in exchange for continued trading privileges, blurring the line between private commerce and public finance in ways that would echo for centuries. The tension is that this made the crown genuinely dependent on merchant goodwill, a striking reversal in a world where kings were assumed to hold all the power. Even monarchs, it turns out, occasionally needed permission from men who dealt only in fleece and thread. Calais, an English-held port on the northern coast of France, became the fixed staple town through which vast quantities of English wool were required to pass. Positioning the staple at Calais gave England direct control over a crucial gateway into continental European markets, allowing customs officials to inspect, tax, and record wool shipments before they ever reached Flemish or French buyers. The tension is that holding this single narrow choke point made the entire wool trade vulnerable to any disruption at Calais itself, whether war, siege, or simple mismanagement of the port. Concentrating so much wealth through one narrow gate always offers control, but it never quite offers safety. English sheep farming reshaped the physical landscape of the countryside itself, as more and more land was given over to grazing rather than growing food. Wealthy landowners, drawn by the reliable profits of wool, increasingly converted farmland, traditionally used for crops, into pasture for large flocks, a shift that steadily changed both the English countryside and the rhythms of rural life. The tension is a difficult one. This shift toward sheep farming displaced many tenant farmers from land their families had worked for generations, trading their livelihoods for wool profits that flowed mostly to landowners rather than laborers. A pasture full of grazing sheep, seen from a distance, can look peaceful and still represent real human upheaval underneath. Contemporary writers of the period openly criticized this transformation, coining phrases suggesting that sheep themselves were, in effect, devouring the people who once farmed that same land. Critics of enclosure argued that a small number of profitable sheep required far fewer hands to tend than the crops that land had previously supported, leaving displaced farming families to seek uncertain work in growing towns instead. The tension reflects a pattern that recurs across economic history. Increased efficiency in one sector often comes paired with real disruption for the people whose labor that efficiency replaces. Progress, even when it enriches a nation on paper, rarely lands evenly across every life it touches. Wool taxation grew so central to English royal finance that Parliament itself became deeply entangled in decisions about how heavily wool exports should be taxed. Because raising wool duties required parliamentary approval, English monarchs seeking funds for wars or royal projects were repeatedly forced into negotiation with representatives of merchants and landowners whose fortunes depended on the wool trade. The tension is that this recurring negotiation slowly, unintentionally strengthened Parliament's role in English governance, since the Crown's dependence on wool revenue gave lawmakers genuine leverage they could use again and again. A tax on fleece, in this quiet way, helped shape the balance of an entire nation's government. By the 15th century, English cloth, rather than raw wool, had become the country's dominant export, a shift that marked a genuine turning point in the nation's economic identity. English weavers, benefiting from decades of imported expertise and steady royal encouragement, began producing finished woolen cloth in quantities large enough to compete directly in markets that had once been dominated entirely by Flemish and Italian weavers. The tension is that this success came at Flanders' expense, a quiet, gradual redistribution of wealth, as England kept for itself the value that had once flowed almost entirely across the sea. One region's rise in the story of cloth has nearly always meant another region's quiet decline. English wool merchants and cloth producers eventually organized into powerful trading companies, coordinating exports and defending shared commercial interests on a scale individual merchants never could alone. Organizations such as the Merchant Adventurers gained royal charters granting them privileged rights to trade English cloth abroad, particularly into ports along the North Sea and Baltic coasts where demand for English textiles steadily grew. The tension is that these chartered companies, much like the staple before them, concentrated enormous trading privilege in relatively few hands, shaping English commerce around powerful, tightly organized groups rather than open competition. Every era, it seems, finds its own way of deciding who gets closest to the gate of prosperity. Wool wealth built more than merchant fortunes in medieval England. It built some of the country's most enduring churches and civic buildings, funded almost entirely by grateful cloth merchants. Across the wool-producing regions of England, so-called wool churches rose in remarkable scale and beauty, paid for by merchants and clothiers eager to display both their piety and their prosperity in stone and stained glass. The tension is one of visible inequality. Such grand buildings stood as unmistakable monuments to wealth concentrated among a relative few, even as ordinary spinners and weavers who made that wealth possible often lived in far humbler circumstances. Stone remembers wealth far longer than it remembers the countless quiet hands that first spun it into being. English wool towns developed their own distinct identities, each associated with particular grades, weights, or finishes of cloth that buyers across Europe came to recognize by name. Towns in regions such as the Cotswolds and East Anglia became especially renowned for the quality of their local wool and the skill of their weavers, their reputations carefully built and protected across generations of careful craftsmanship. The tension is the same fragile one that shadowed Flanders before them. Reputation, once built, still had to be defended constantly against shortcuts, inferior imitation, and shifting fashion that could quietly erode demand. This is what makes the English wool story so quietly familiar. Success, however hard won, has never once been allowed to simply rest on its own reputation. By the later medieval period, English wool and cloth had become so central to the kingdom's identity that foreign observers sometimes described the country almost entirely in terms of sheep and thread. Visitors and diplomats from continental Europe frequently commented on the sheer scale of English wool production, noting flocks that stretched across entire counties and towns, whose economies revolved almost completely around the rhythms of shearing, spinning, and weaving. The tension, gentle but persistent, is that such deep dependence on a single industry left the entire kingdom's prosperity closely tied to forces well beyond royal control: weather, disease, and the shifting tastes of foreign buyers. A nation can build extraordinary wealth on wool and still never fully escape wool's quiet, patient risks. Imagine a dyer's workshop on a narrow medieval street, vats bubbling with color, the air sharp with the smell of plants, minerals, and, sometimes, decay. Dyeing was among the most specialized and closely guarded crafts in the entire textile trade, requiring precise knowledge of which plants, insects, or minerals produced which shades, and exactly how long cloth needed to soak to achieve a lasting color. The tension is that dyeing was also physically demanding and often unpleasant work, involving strong-smelling fixatives and long hours standing over hot, chemical-laden vats. Behind every vivid medieval garment stood hours of quiet, uncomfortable labor that history rarely bothered to record in detail. Woad, a humble flowering plant with unremarkable green leaves, held a secret that made it one of medieval Europe's most valuable dye crops. Through a careful fermentation process, woad leaves could be transformed into a deep, lasting blue dye, making the plant so profitable in certain regions that entire local economies grew up around its cultivation and processing. The tension is that woad processing produced an infamously strong, unpleasant odor, so much so that some towns restricted where woad could be processed, balancing prosperity against the simple discomfort of daily life nearby. Even a color as calm and lovely as blue, it turns out, was born from a genuinely difficult, pungent process. Red dye, in the medieval and early modern world, often came from a source almost nobody suspected: the crushed bodies of tiny insects harvested by hand in painstaking quantities. Certain scale insects, when carefully collected and processed, yielded a vivid red or crimson dye so prized that garments colored with it commanded extraordinary prices across European markets. The tension is the sheer scale of labor involved. Producing even a modest quantity of dye required gathering and processing enormous numbers of these tiny insects by hand, one careful harvest at a time. Some of history's richest colors, it turns out, were built from the smallest, most overlooked forms of labor imaginable. Guild membership in the medieval dyeing trade came with real privilege, but also with strict, closely enforced rules designed to protect the craft's reputation above all else. Dyers' guilds often controlled which dyes could legally be used, sometimes banning certain cheaper or less reliable colorants entirely. in an effort to protect the reputation of their town's cloth in distant markets they could not personally oversee. The tension is that these rules, meant to protect quality, could also stifle innovation, punishing dyers who experimented with new techniques even when those techniques might have eventually produced better, more efficient results. Tradition, in trades built on trust, has always cut both ways, protecting reputation while occasionally slowing progress. Fulling, the process of cleaning and thickening woven wool cloth by pounding it in water and clay, transformed loosely woven fabric into something far denser and more durable. Early fulling was done by human feet treading cloth in shallow troughs for hours, exhausting work that was gradually replaced over the medieval period by water-powered fulling mills built along fast-flowing rivers and streams. The tension is one of quiet disruption. As mechanical fulling mills spread, the physically demanding, low-skill labor once performed by hand slowly required fewer workers, a shift that eased some burdens even as it displaced others. Even in the medieval world, machinery was already quietly reshaping who was needed and for how long. The spread of water-powered fulling mills across medieval Europe marked one of the earliest widespread uses of mechanical power in the textile industry. Regions with abundant, fast-flowing rivers, such as parts of England and Flanders, gained a genuine competitive advantage in cloth finishing, since mechanical fulling was faster, more consistent, and ultimately cheaper than relying entirely on human labor. The tension is that this advantage was entirely tied to geography. Towns without suitable rivers simply could not compete on the same terms, no matter how skilled their local weavers happened to be. This is what makes the story of fulling mills so quietly fascinating. Centuries before the word industrial meant anything at all, water was already turning the wheels of manufacturing. Guild structures across the medieval textile trade typically divided workers into careful ranks, from young apprentices to skilled journeymen to fully established masters who alone could train others. An apprentice might spend 7 years or more learning a single craft under a master's supervision, receiving room, board, and training in exchange for years of largely unpaid or minimally paid labor. The tension is that this system, while preserving valuable skill across generations, also concentrated real economic power in the hands of established masters who controlled exactly how many new competitors were allowed to enter their trade each year. Skill in the guild world was passed down carefully and never given away freely. Women played an enormous, often under-acknowledged role throughout the medieval textile economy, particularly in spinning, a task so closely associated with female labor that the word for an unmarried woman still carries its echo today. While formal guild membership and the most prestigious weaving and merchant roles were frequently restricted to men, spinning itself remained one of the few reliable sources of independent income available to women across medieval Europe. The tension is a quiet, persistent one. The labor considered essential to nearly every stage of cloth production was also often the least visible and least well compensated in the entire chain. Some of history's most necessary work has always been carried out by hands history barely bothered to name. Certain towns became so associated with a single specific dye or finish that their name alone functioned as a kind of quality guarantee across distant markets. Buyers hundreds of miles away could request cloth in the manner of a particular renowned dyeing town, trusting that reputation had already done the work of quality control long before the goods ever arrived. The tension is that maintaining such a reputation required constant vigilance, since a single batch of poorly dyed or fading cloth could undo decades of carefully built trust in markets a town's own dyers would never personally visit. Reputation, once again, proved to be the real currency underlying every bolt of cloth that changed hands. As demand for dyed cloth grew across medieval and early modern Europe, the search for reliable, affordable dye sources became a genuine driver of long-distance trade in its own right. Merchants sought out dye plants, minerals, and insects from increasingly distant regions, weaving dye ingredients into the same expanding trade networks that already carried wool, silk, and spices across seas and mountain ranges. The tension is that this pursuit of color eventually became entangled with some of history's more troubling colonial ventures, as later centuries saw dye crops cultivated under exploitative and often forced labor conditions in distant colonies. Beauty, pursued without restraint, has too often demanded a cost paid by people who never saw the finished cloth at all. It is worth pausing on that quietly and remembering it honestly before drifting back toward gentler chapters of this story. By the close of the medieval period, dyeing and finishing had become just as economically significant as the raw spinning and weaving that came before them. Finished, well-dyed cloth commanded prices many times higher than plain undyed fabric, meaning that the final stages of production, often concentrated in wealthy towns with established guild traditions, captured a disproportionate share of the textile trade's overall profit. The tension is a pattern that would repeat again and again across economic history. Value tends to concentrate wherever the final, most visible transformation happens, rewarding finishing far more generously than the raw material or early labor that made it possible. Cloth, dyed and finished, carried more than color. It carried, quietly, the whole uneven architecture of who profited and by how much. Along the cold, wind-swept coasts of the Baltic and North Seas, a loose alliance of trading towns quietly built one of medieval Europe's most powerful commercial networks. The Hanseatic League, a federation of merchant guilds and market towns stretching from northern Germany to Scandinavia and beyond, coordinated trade, protected shared shipping routes, and negotiated collectively with kings and princes who might otherwise have taxed individual merchants into ruin. The tension is that this power depended entirely on cooperation between towns that were, in most other respects, fierce rivals, a fragile unity held together mainly by shared self-interest. Even history's most formidable trading networks, it turns out, have often been built on nothing sturdier than mutual convenience. Cloth, alongside furs, timber, grain, and fish, moved steadily through Hanseatic ports, carried by merchant ships following well-established seasonal routes across some of Europe's coldest waters. Hanseatic merchants established trading posts, known as contours, in major foreign cities, creating secure, semi-independent enclaves where League merchants could store goods, negotiate deals, and operate largely under their own rules even while doing business abroad. The tension is that these privileged enclaves often bred resentment among local merchants and rulers, who watched foreign traders operate with advantages they themselves could not claim in their own cities. Privilege granted to outsiders, however useful for trade, has rarely gone unnoticed or unresented by those left standing just outside it. Imagine a Hanseatic cog, a broad, sturdy sailing ship, pushing out from a northern German harbor into gray winter seas, its hold packed tightly with bundled cloth and barrels of goods. These merchant vessels braved genuinely dangerous northern waters on a predictable seasonal schedule, their captains balancing the profits of an early crossing against the very real risk of storms that could sink a ship and an entire season's investment in a single night. The tension between ambition and danger defined nearly every voyage undertaken across these northern trade routes. Fortune, carried this way, always traveled beside genuine risk, tied together as tightly as cargo lashed to a deck. The Hanseatic League's influence grew powerful enough that member towns occasionally went to war, or threatened to, over disputes involving trade rights and access to markets. Conflicts between the League and rival kingdoms sometimes escalated into naval blockades or outright military confrontation, as the League defended trading privileges its merchants had spent generations carefully negotiating and building. The tension is a striking one to sit with quietly. A network built primarily around commerce and cloth proved willing, when its economic interests were threatened, to act with genuine military force. Trade and power, across most of history, have rarely stayed as separate as either side liked to pretend. Standardized weights, measures, and trading practices across Hanseatic ports gave merchants a rare and valuable gift: predictability across a network of ports separated by hundreds of miles and multiple languages. League towns worked to align their commercial laws and practices closely enough that a merchant trading cloth in one Hanseatic port could reasonably expect similar rules, protections, and expectations in another, reducing the constant renegotiation that plagued less coordinated trade networks. The tension is that maintaining this consistency required constant diplomatic effort, as member towns periodically disagreed over exactly how uniform their practices truly needed to be. Cooperation this ambitious, even when it worked beautifully, never once ran entirely without friction. English wool and cloth found eager buyers in Hanseatic ports, weaving England's domestic textile industry directly into this vast northern European trading web. English merchants operating in Hanseatic territory and Hanseatic merchants trading in England developed a genuinely interdependent relationship, each side relying on the other's ships, warehouses, and market knowledge to move cloth efficiently across the North Sea. The tension is that this interdependence occasionally soured into open rivalry, as English merchants grew resentful of Hanseatic trading privileges within their own country, privileges that English traders were not always granted in return abroad. Even the closest trading partnerships, history shows again and again, could curdle quickly once one side felt the balance had tipped unfairly. Baltic ports developed their own specialized role within the broader European textile economy, often serving as a crucial gateway connecting Western cloth markets to raw materials and goods from further east. Towns along the Baltic coast facilitated trade in flax, hemp, and other fiber-adjacent goods, alongside finished wool and linen cloth arriving from Western Europe, positioning the region as a genuine crossroads rather than merely a distant edge of the trading world. The tension is that this position, valuable as it was, also left Baltic towns exposed to shifting alliances and rivalries among the larger powers surrounding them. Sitting at a crossroads has always offered prosperity, and just as reliably, offered vulnerability in equal measure. Marine insurance, in its earliest and most informal forms, began quietly emerging from the genuine risks merchants faced sending cloth and other goods across dangerous northern waters. Groups of merchants sometimes agreed, informally at first, to share the financial risk of a lost shipment, spreading potential losses across several traders rather than leaving any single merchant to absorb a ruinous loss alone. The tension is that formalizing this kind of shared risk took centuries to fully mature into anything resembling modern insurance, remaining, for a very long time, a matter of personal trust and handshake agreement rather than formal contract. This is what makes early trade finance so quietly moving. Long before any institution existed to manage risk, merchants were already learning, informally, that shared burden was easier to carry than solitary loss. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Hanseatic League's dominance had begun to slowly erode, challenged by the rising power of centralized nation-states, less willing to tolerate an independent merchant network operating within their borders. Kingdoms such as England and the emerging Dutch trading powers increasingly built their own strong merchant fleets and trading companies, competing directly with Hanseatic merchants in ports the League had once dominated largely unchallenged. The tension is the same quiet, recurring pattern seen throughout textile history. No trading advantage, however dominant it once seemed, has ever proven entirely permanent against patient, well-organized competition. Even the mightiest trading league in medieval Europe eventually discovered that dominance, however comfortable, must always be defended, and can never simply be assumed. The Hanseatic story, taken as a whole, reveals something essential about how cloth-based wealth actually traveled across medieval Europe, not along a single road, but through an entire living web of ports, ships, and mutual obligation. Cloth moved from English pastures to Flemish looms, from Baltic warehouses to Mediterranean markets, carried each step of the way by networks of trust built and rebuilt across generations of merchants who mostly never met one another directly. The tension and the quiet wonder is the same throughout. An economy this vast and interconnected ran almost entirely on reputation, correspondence, and the patient accumulation of trust between strangers. Long before any wire or ledger connected the modern world, thread and trust had already been quietly doing exactly the same work. Across much of medieval and early modern Europe, owning a large flock of sheep functioned as a genuinely reliable store of wealth, not unlike owning land or gold. Sheep reproduced, grew wool that could be sheared and sold annually, and required relatively modest daily care compared to many other forms of livestock, making flocks an attractive, self-renewing form of accumulated wealth for those able to acquire them. The tension is that this wealth still carried real risk. Disease could sweep through a flock in a single season, and a sudden cold snap or lack of pasture could quietly erase years of careful, patient breeding. Even wealth that renewed itself, year after year, was never entirely free from the unpredictability of the natural world it depended on. Wool prices across medieval Europe fluctuated with a rhythm that merchants and monarchs alike learned to watch closely, since so much depended on their steady rise or sudden fall. A poor lambing season, a disease outbreak among flocks, or a disruption to trade routes could send wool prices sharply upward, squeezing weavers who depended on affordable raw material to keep their looms profitably running. The tension is that these price swings rippled outward well beyond the wool trade itself, affecting royal tax revenue, merchant fortunes, and the livelihoods of entire towns whose economies were built almost entirely around cloth. A single flock's fortunes, multiplied across a whole trading region, could quietly move the fate of nations. Monastic communities across medieval Europe became, somewhat unexpectedly, some of the era's most significant wool producers, managing enormous flocks across lands granted to them over generations. Cistercian monasteries in particular developed a genuine reputation for careful, disciplined sheep husbandry, their large, well-managed flocks producing wool of consistently high quality that commanded strong prices in markets across Europe. The tension is a quiet irony worth sitting with. Religious communities devoted to simplicity and withdrawal from worldly concerns became, through their careful stewardship of land and flocks, genuinely significant commercial players in Europe's cloth economy. Devotion and commerce, it turns out, have coexisted more often and more comfortably than either side has usually cared to admit. Land enclosure, the conversion of shared or common farmland into privately controlled pasture, accelerated sharply as wool profits grew more and more attractive to English landowners. Enclosure allowed landowners to manage larger, more efficient sheep flocks on land that had previously supported multiple small farming families working scattered strips of shared ground. The tension is difficult, and history does not soften it. Enclosure displaced countless rural families from land and livelihoods their communities had depended on for generations, trading collective subsistence for concentrated private profit. Progress measured only in wool and coin has rarely told the whole story of what, quietly, that same progress left behind. Displaced by enclosure, many rural families drifted toward growing towns and cities in search of new work, often finding it, ironically, within the very textile trade that had helped displace them. Former farming families frequently found employment as spinners, weavers, or laborers within the expanding cloth industry, trading the rhythms of agricultural life for the very different rhythms of urban textile production. The tension is one of quiet continuity beneath obvious disruption. The same industry that transformed the countryside also, in its own uneven way, absorbed many of the people it had first displaced. Economic change, however painful in the moment, has a persistent habit of eventually reabsorbing what it first disturbs. Wool remained so central to certain regional economies that entire local dialects, customs, and folk traditions grew up intertwined with the rhythms of shearing season and market day. Annual sheep shearing became a genuine community event in many wool-producing regions, marked by shared labor, local celebration, and careful communal calculation of exactly how much each flock had yielded that year. The tension is gentle here, more bittersweet than difficult. Such traditions, built around a single dominant local industry, inevitably faded whenever that industry itself eventually declined or moved elsewhere. Culture, it turns out, roots itself as readily in wool and shearing shears as it does in anything grander. Wool also quietly shaped early forms of long-term financial planning, as merchants and landowners increasingly needed ways to manage income that arrived, predictably, only once or twice a year at shearing and market time. Merchants developed early credit arrangements, advancing money against future wool harvests, allowing sheep farmers to smooth out their income across the full year, rather than waiting entirely for shearing season to receive payment. The tension is that these early credit arrangements carried real risk for both sides. A farmer who defaulted on a bad year left the lending merchant exposed, while an overly aggressive merchant could quietly trap a farmer in mounting debt. Even in its earliest, simplest forms, credit has always balanced genuine help against genuine risk. Sheep breeds themselves became objects of careful selection and pride, as farmers across different regions worked patiently across generations to improve the length, softness, and yield of their flock's wool. Particular English and Spanish sheep breeds became especially prized for the exceptional quality of their fleece, their reputations carefully protected, and in some cases their export deliberately restricted, to to preserve a region's competitive advantage in the wool trade. The tension is that such restrictions inevitably invited smuggling, as rival regions grew eager to acquire prized breeding stock they were officially forbidden from obtaining. Even sheep, gentle and unassuming as they are, occasionally became the quiet subject of genuine international intrigue. Spain, in particular, developed one of history's most famous wool economies, built around a hardy, fine-fleeced breed whose export the Spanish crown guarded jealously for centuries. Spanish merino sheep produced wool prized across Europe for its exceptional fineness and softness, and Spanish authorities restricted the export of live merino sheep, protecting a national advantage that helped fund the Spanish crown for generations. The tension is that eventually, despite careful restriction, merino sheep were gifted or smuggled to other nations, gradually spreading the breed's advantages far beyond Spain's own borders, and quietly eroding the very advantage the crown had worked so hard to protect. This is what makes the story of merino wool so hauntingly familiar. No advantage this valuable, however carefully guarded, has ever stayed contained forever. By the early modern period, wool had become so thoroughly woven into national identity and finance across much of Europe that its story was, in many ways, simply the story of these nations' broader economic development. From English royal wool taxes to Spanish crown-protected merino flocks to Flemish and Hanseatic trading networks, the wool and cloth trade had quietly shaped tax systems, land use, urban growth, and even the balance of political power across an entire continent. The tension, seen from this wide a distance, softens into something closer to wonder. An ordinary, humble fiber had, patiently and unglamorously, helped build the financial architecture of an entire era. Few materials in human history have shaped as much, while asking for so little recognition in return. Florence, a city with no coastline and no great wool-producing hills of its own, built one of Renaissance Europe's most sophisticated economies almost entirely around processing cloth made from other people's raw material. Florentine merchants imported raw and partially finished wool from England, Spain, and elsewhere, then used the city's exceptional dyeing and finishing skill to transform it into some of the most prized, expensive cloth sold anywhere in Europe. The tension is that this model required extraordinary coordination across long, vulnerable supply chains, since Florence's prosperity depended entirely on wool arriving reliably from distant, sometimes politically unstable regions. A city famous for its art and architecture was, underneath its beauty, quietly powered by imported fleece and careful finishing craft. Florence organized its wool trade through a powerful guild known as the Arte della Lana, one of the most influential organizations in the entire city's political and economic life. This wool guild regulated nearly every stage of cloth production within Florence, from importing raw wool to overseeing dyeing standards, and its members, wealthy wool merchants and manufacturers, held genuine political power within the city's governing institutions. The tension is that this concentration of economic and political power in a single guild's hands meant that Florence's fortunes and its politics rose and fell together with the health of its wool trade. In Florence, more clearly than almost anywhere else in medieval Europe, cloth and governance were quite literally woven from the same threads. The wealth generated by Florence's wool trade eventually financed something far grander than fine clothing. It helped fund an extraordinary flourishing of art, architecture, and learning that later generations would come to call the Renaissance. Prominent Florentine banking families, including the Medici, built fortunes intertwined with the wool and cloth trade, and used that wealth to commission some of the era's most celebrated paintings, sculptures, and buildings. The tension is a hopeful one, rare enough in this story to be worth savoring. Profit from thread and dye helped make possible some of the most enduring beauty humanity has ever produced. Even wealth, built from something as ordinary as cloth, can, given the right hands, blossom into something extraordinary. The Medici family, whose name would eventually become synonymous with banking and political power, built their earliest fortunes partly on wool and textile trade, before expanding decisively into finance. Early Medici wealth grew from involvement in the wool and cloth business common to many prominent Florentine families, providing both capital and commercial connections that the family later leveraged to build one of Renaissance Europe's most powerful banking houses. The tension is that this transition from cloth merchant to banker reveals something important about how medieval wealth actually moved and grew. Trade profits, patiently reinvested, so often became the seed capital for entirely new forms of financial power. Thread, in Florence, quietly financed the birth of modern banking itself. Florentine bankers, building on wealth first generated by cloth trading, developed sophisticated financial instruments that allowed merchants to move money and manage risk across distances no single coin could safely travel. Bills of exchange, an early form of paper-based credit, let a merchant in one city pay a debt in another without physically transporting gold or silver, reducing the very real danger of robbery that had long shadowed long-distance trade. The tension is that this innovation required an enormous amount of trust between bankers across different cities, a network of mutual confidence that took generations of careful, reputation-driven relationship building to establish. Even paper promises, it turns out, had to be earned before they could ever be trusted. Not every chapter of Florence's cloth and finance story ended well, and the city's deep entanglement between wool wealth and banking eventually exposed it to genuine financial danger. Florentine banking houses that lent heavily to foreign kings and princes to finance wars and royal ambitions sometimes found themselves unable to collect on those loans when a monarch simply refused or was unable to repay what was owed. The tension came to a genuine crisis when major Florentine banks, having lent enormous sums to English and other foreign crowns, suffered severe financial strain after those loans went unpaid, shaking confidence across the city's entire banking system. Wealth built from patient centuries of cloth and careful finance could still, in a single royal default, be brought to the very edge of ruin. The lesson Florentine bankers learned from these early financial crises would echo for centuries afterward, through every era of lending and borrowing that followed. Lending to powerful borrowers who could not easily be forced to repay, whether kings, princes, or later, entire governments, carried a very particular kind of risk that ordinary commercial lending between merchants rarely involved. The tension, distilled to its essence, is timeless. The grandest borrowers have always offered the most tempting returns, and just as reliably, the least real recourse if they simply choose not to pay. This is what makes Florence's story so quietly haunting. Some of history's earliest and most sophisticated bankers learned, the hard way, a lesson that lenders would keep relearning for the next several centuries. Florence's wool guild eventually faced growing competition from other Italian and European cloth centers, each developing its own specialties and undercutting Florence's once dominant position in certain markets. Cities such as Venice and later emerging centers across northern Europe developed competing textile industries, gradually chipping away at the near monopoly Florence had once enjoyed over the finest finished woolen cloth. The tension is the same familiar pattern seen throughout this story, repeating itself yet again. Dominance in the cloth trade, however impressive, has never once proven permanent against patient, determined rivals. Florence, like Flanders before it, discovered that even the finest reputation eventually has to share the stage. Beyond wool, Florence and other Italian cities increasingly cultivated their own silk industries, weaving fine silk cloth that rivaled goods once available only through the long, expensive journey along Asian trade routes. Italian silk workshops developed techniques rivaling those of Byzantium and Persia, gradually establishing Italy as a genuine silk-producing power in its own right, rather than merely a distant buyer of Eastern luxury goods. The tension is a subtle one of shifting balance. As Europe grew more capable of producing its own fine silk, the ancient economic advantage once held so tightly by distant Asian producers slowly, quietly narrowed. Even the longest head start in history, it seems, eventually meets patient imitation. Renaissance Italy's combined wool and silk industries created a genuinely diversified textile economy, one considerably less vulnerable to the fortunes of any single fiber or single foreign supplier. Cities that produced both fine wool cloth and increasingly sophisticated silk textiles could weather disruptions to either trade more comfortably than regions, like earlier Flanders, that had depended almost entirely on a single imported raw material. The tension, softened by hindsight, offers a genuinely useful lesson: diversification, even in an age long before the word carried any formal economic meaning, quietly protected wealth in ways that specialization alone never could. Sometimes the wisest strategy, even for an entire city's economy, is simply not depending too heavily on any single thread. By the height of the Renaissance, Italian textile and banking wealth had become so deeply intertwined that separating the two stories would mean losing the truth of either one. Fortunes built from wool, silk, and dye financed not only art and architecture, but also the increasingly sophisticated banking systems that would go on to shape European finance for centuries to come. The tension, by this point in the story, has softened into something closer to admiration. An industry built on shearing, spinning, and dyeing had quietly grown into one of the intellectual and financial engines of an entire cultural rebirth. This is what makes the Renaissance chapter of textile history so hauntingly beautiful. Genius, it turns out, has often needed patient, unglamorous commerce quietly working beneath it. For nearly 3,000 years, wool had reigned as Europe's dominant fiber, and almost no one alive in the 16th century could have imagined a rival ever displacing it. Yet even as Florence and England built extraordinary wealth on sheep and cloth, a very different fiber was quietly growing in fields across India, one that would eventually reshape the entire global textile economy far more completely than wool ever had. The tension is that change, this large, rarely announces itself early. For centuries, cotton remained a distant curiosity to most Europeans, admired in imported cloth, but not yet understood as a genuine threat to wool's dominance. History's largest shifts, again and again, have crept in quietly long before anyone recognized them as the beginning of an ending. Indian weavers had, for well over 1,000 years, developed textile skill with cotton that European traders, once they finally encountered it directly, could barely believe. regions across India produced cotton cloth of extraordinary fineness and vivid, color-fast dye work, techniques including complex resist dyeing and printing methods that remained, for a long time, far beyond what European workshops could reliably reproduce. The tension is that once European trading companies gained direct access to these Indian textile centers, they began importing cotton cloth in quantities large enough to genuinely worry wool producers back home, who watched a new competitor arrive seemingly overnight. An industry with roots 1,000 years deep, once truly noticed, could unsettle an ocean away almost immediately. European wool interests did not accept this new competition quietly, and several nations passed laws specifically designed to protect domestic wool producers from the growing popularity of imported cotton cloth. England, in particular, enacted restrictions limiting the import and even the domestic wearing of certain printed cotton textiles, an attempt to shield its enormous wool industry from a fiber that many buyers were beginning to prefer for its lightness, washability, and vivid printed patterns. The tension is that such protective laws, however well-intentioned for wool producers, could not indefinitely hold back a genuine shift in consumer preference once buyers had experienced cotton's real practical advantages. Legislation, history shows again and again, can slow a changing tide for a while, but it has rarely managed to stop one entirely. Imagine an English merchant in the early 18th century, standing in a warehouse stacked high with both traditional wool bolts and newly fashionable printed cotton, quietly calculating which fiber the coming decades truly belonged to. Demand for lighter, more colorful, more easily washed cotton cloth was steadily rising among European consumers, even as wool interests fought hard through both law and lobbying to preserve their centuries-old dominance over European wardrobes. The tension is a genuinely uncomfortable one for an industry that had shaped nations for centuries. An entire established order, built on sheep and careful tradition, was slowly losing ground to a fiber it had once dismissed as a passing novelty. Even the deepest, most established economic order eventually meets a rival it cannot simply legislate away. The mechanization of cloth production, when it finally arrived in full force during the 18th century, transformed textiles from a craft rooted in individual skill into something closer to a coordinated industrial system. A series of inventions, including mechanized spinning devices capable of producing many threads at once and improved looms that dramatically increased weaving speed, allowed a single workshop to produce cloth at a scale that would have seemed impossible to any medieval weaver. The tension is profound and genuinely difficult. This new efficiency displaced enormous numbers of skilled hand spinners and weavers whose careful, generations-old craft could no longer compete on price or speed against machines. Progress, once again, arrived carrying real gifts in one hand and real loss in the other. Early textile machinery required a source of power beyond human muscle, and fast-flowing rivers, much as they had for medieval fulling mills centuries earlier, became the first great engines of this new industrial age. Water-powered spinning and weaving mills sprang up along suitable rivers, drawing workers away from scattered rural cottages and into large, centralized factory buildings organized around the rhythm of the machines rather than the rhythm of individual households. The tension is that this centralization fundamentally changed the nature of textile labor, replacing the relative independence of cottage spinning and weaving with the fixed hours, close supervision, and unfamiliar discipline of factory work. The loom had not simply grown faster. The entire shape of a working life had quietly changed around it. Steam power. Arriving in the later 18th and early 19th centuries, freed textile mills from their dependence on rivers entirely, allowing factories to be built wherever coal and labor were both available. This shift concentrated textile production even further into large industrial cities, where enormous mills employed hundreds or even thousands of workers under a single roof, producing cloth at a volume and speed that would have seemed almost unimaginable only a century before. The tension is that these growing industrial cities frequently struggled to keep pace with the sheer number of workers arriving in search of factory employment, resulting in crowded, difficult living conditions for many who came seeking a better life than the countryside could offer. The machines that clothed an entire growing world asked, in return, a great deal from the people who tended them. Among the difficult truths of the early industrial textile era is the widespread employment of children in spinning and weaving mills, often for long hours and modest pay in physically demanding, sometimes genuinely dangerous conditions. Child labor in textile factories became common enough during this period that it eventually drew serious public concern, prompting some of history's earliest labor reform movements and regulations, specifically aimed at limiting working hours and conditions for young mill workers. The tension here deserves honesty rather than detail. Industrial progress, in this chapter of the textile story, was built in part on labor that no modern conscience could accept. A cost history should remember clearly rather than soften. Real progress, this era teaches quietly but firmly, must eventually be measured not only by what it produces, but by who is asked to pay for it. Factory owners and mill workers found themselves on opposite sides of a genuinely new kind of economic relationship, one that earlier guild-based craft traditions had never quite required either side to navigate. Unlike medieval guild apprentices working toward eventual mastery of a craft, many industrial mill workers had little realistic path toward ownership or independence, spending entire working lives as wage laborers within factories owned by someone else entirely. The tension building within this new arrangement would eventually give rise to organized labor movements, as textile workers across industrializing nations began collectively pressing for safer conditions, fairer wages, and reasonable working hours. The cloth trade, once again, found itself quietly writing chapters of history far beyond anything to do with thread or dye alone. By the early 19th century, mechanized cotton production, centered heavily in rapidly industrializing regions of England, had grown into one of the largest and most profitable industries the world had ever seen. English cotton mills, powered first by water and increasingly by steam, processed raw cotton into finished cloth at a scale that dwarfed the old wool trade's most prosperous medieval centuries, exporting textiles to markets across the entire expanding global economy. The tension, quiet but immense, is where this raw cotton itself was coming from, and under exactly what conditions it was being grown and picked, a question this story cannot honestly continue without addressing directly. The next chapter of this story asks us to look, briefly and honestly, at a harder truth beneath the cotton's soft, ordinary appearance. Much of the raw cotton feeding Britain's booming textile mills during the 18th and 19th centuries was grown across the southern United States on plantations that depended entirely on the forced, unpaid labor of enslaved people. Millions of enslaved men, women, and children were compelled to plant, tend, and harvest cotton under brutal conditions, their labor forming the hidden foundation beneath one of the era's most profitable global industries. This is a history that deserves to be named honestly rather than passed over quietly, because the comfort and prosperity built from cotton cloth in this period came, for a great many people, at the cost of their freedom and their lives. Even the softest, most ordinary fabric can carry within its history a debt that no accounting of profit and trade alone could ever fully settle. The economic machinery connecting enslaved cotton labor to European textile mills stretched across an entire ocean, tying together plantations, shipping networks, banks, and factories into a single, deeply troubling system of production. Cotton grown under forced labor was shipped to processing centers, financed along the way by banks and insurers who profited from the trade without ever setting foot on a single plantation, a chain of remove that allowed many participants to avoid confronting the human cost directly. The tension and the honest reckoning is that entire national economies grew wealthy on a system built upon suffering, a truth that took generations of moral struggle and eventual abolition movements to finally confront and dismantle. History asks us, gently but firmly, to hold both truths together: genuine economic transformation and genuine, unforgivable human cost. Abolition movements across Britain, the United States, and elsewhere grew, over decades, into powerful forces that eventually forced entire nations to reckon with the moral cost embedded in their most profitable industries. The eventual end of legal slavery came only after long, difficult struggle, and it did not immediately end the deep economic inequalities that forced labor had built into cotton-growing regions, inequalities that would echo for generations afterward. The tension, softened only slightly by time, is that progress toward justice in this story arrived slowly, unevenly, and only through sustained human effort and moral courage rather than through the industry's own conscience alone. This is worth remembering quietly tonight, that even history's darkest economic chapters have, eventually, been challenged by people who insisted a fairer story was possible. In the aftermath of abolition, cotton production across the American South shifted toward new systems of labor that, while no longer legally enslaved, still often left workers trapped in cycles of poverty and debt for generations. Sharecropping arrangements frequently bound formerly enslaved families and their descendants to the very same land, working under contracts that left them perpetually indebted to landowners who controlled both their housing and their access to credit. The tension is a quiet, lingering one. The formal end of slavery did not, on its own, dissolve the deep economic structures that forced labor had built, leaving real inequality to persist long after the law itself had changed. Justice, this chapter reminds us gently, is rarely completed by a single law alone. It asks, again and again, for continued effort long after the headline moment has passed. Cotton cultivation, once concentrated so heavily around the Atlantic trade, gradually expanded into new regions across the world as global demand for cheap, mass-produced textiles continued its steady climb through the 19th and 20th centuries. India, Egypt, and later other regions across Asia and Africa developed their own large-scale cotton industries, some shaped by colonial economic policy that prioritized raw material extraction for distant factories over the development of local textile manufacturing. The tension is a familiar shadow from earlier in this very story. Regions rich in raw material often found themselves capturing only a small fraction of the profit their resources ultimately generated elsewhere. The uneven distribution of textile wealth, seen clearly now across centuries, has rarely favored the hands that first touched the raw fiber. By the close of the 19th century, the global textile trade had grown into something almost unrecognizable compared to the modest medieval cloth halls of Flanders or the careful wool guilds of early Florence. Steamships and eventually railroads moved raw cotton and finished cloth across the world with a speed and reliability that medieval and Renaissance merchants could scarcely have imagined, connecting cotton fields, mills, and consumers across continents into a single, tightly interlinked global market. The tension is that this interconnection, for all its efficiency, also meant that economic trouble in one region, a bad harvest, a market crash, a labor dispute, could now ripple outward across the entire connected world far more quickly than ever before. This is what makes the story of global textiles so quietly sobering. The more tightly the world's threads became connected, the further any single disruption could now travel. Wool, though no longer the singular dominant fiber it had once been, did not disappear from the global economy. It simply settled into a smaller, more specialized role alongside cotton, and eventually, synthetic fibers developed in the 20th century. Countries such as Australia and New Zealand, with vast open grazing land well suited to enormous sheep flocks, became major modern wool producers, continuing a tradition stretching back in an unbroken thread to those very first Neolithic herders in ancient Anatolia. The tension, gentler now than earlier chapters of this story, is simply the passage of time itself. No single fiber, however dominant it once seemed, was ever destined to remain unchallenged forever. Wool's long reign had ended, but its story, quietly, had not. The 20th century brought a genuinely new kind of fiber into the world's wardrobes, one grown not from any plant or animal at all, but synthesized directly from chemistry in a laboratory. Nylon, first developed in the 1930s, and later polyester and other synthetic fibers, offered manufacturers a way to produce cloth without depending on unpredictable harvests, grazing land, or seasonal weather, a genuinely radical departure from every fiber that had come before it. The tension is that synthetic fibers, for all their convenience and low cost, also introduced entirely new questions about durability, environmental impact, and the true long-term cost of clothing produced this quickly and this cheaply. After thousands of years of fiber grown patiently from soil and animal, humanity had, quite suddenly, learned to conjure cloth from chemistry alone. Imagine a mid-20th century textile factory humming with a very different rhythm than any medieval weaving hall. Rows of automated machines producing synthetic and natural fibers alike at a volume no earlier century could have supported. Mass production techniques, refined further through decades of industrial development, allowed clothing to be manufactured cheaply and quickly enough that garments once carefully mended and preserved for years began, gradually, to be treated as far more disposable than any earlier generation would have imagined possible. The tension is a quiet but significant one. Cloth that had once represented weeks or months of patient human labor could now be produced, worn briefly, and discarded within a single season. The very meaning of a garment's value had, over the span of a few generations, been quietly rewritten. Textile manufacturing, chasing lower costs, gradually shifted away from the wealthy industrialized nations that had built the original factories, moving instead toward regions offering cheaper labor and looser regulation. Over the course of the later 20th century, large portions of the world's clothing production relocated to parts of Asia, Central America, and elsewhere, following a pattern of cost-driven relocation that would have felt entirely familiar to medieval merchants chasing cheaper wool centuries earlier. The tension is that this relocation, while lowering prices for consumers in wealthier nations, often placed enormous pressure on workers in these new manufacturing centers, echoing, in updated form, many of the difficult labor conditions this very story has already traced through earlier centuries. The specific geography of textile labor had shifted dramatically, and yet, quietly, some of its oldest tensions had not. Global trade agreements and shipping innovations, including the widespread adoption of standardized shipping containers in the mid-20th century, dramatically lowered the cost of moving finished cloth and garments across vast distances. What once took a medieval merchant months of dangerous overland or sea travel could now be accomplished by a single container ship carrying thousands of garments across an ocean in a matter of weeks, connecting distant factories to consumers with a speed no earlier era of this story could have imagined. The tension is that this efficiency, however impressive, also further obscured the origins of everyday clothing, leaving most consumers with little visibility into exactly where or under what conditions their garments had actually been made. Distance, once a merchant's greatest obstacle, had become, in this new era, almost invisible entirely. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, clothing had become dramatically cheaper relative to income than at almost any previous point in this entire long history, a shift with genuinely significant consequences for how people related to the garments they wore. So-called fast fashion, characterized by rapidly changing styles and extremely low prices, encouraged consumers to purchase and discard clothing at a pace that would have been utterly unthinkable to medieval spinners who spent months producing a single bolt of cloth by hand. The tension is one this entire story has quietly built toward from its very beginning. The deep patience once required to turn raw fiber into finished cloth had, over centuries, been almost entirely engineered away. This is what makes the modern chapter of textile history so quietly haunting. Humanity spent thousands of years learning to make cloth slowly and carefully, only to spend its final centuries learning, just as diligently, how to make it fast. Concerns about the environmental cost of modern textile production grew increasingly serious toward the end of the 20th century as the true scale of water use, chemical dyeing, and textile waste became better understood by researchers and the public alike. Modern dyeing processes, descended in spirit from those same ancient woad vats and crushed insect dyes, now operate at an industrial scale that raised genuine questions about water pollution, chemical runoff, and the sheer volume of textile waste generated by an industry producing clothing faster than it had ever been produced before. The tension is a genuinely difficult one for the present era to sit with. An industry that once moved at the patient pace of a spinning wheel now moves fast enough to raise real questions about whether the planet itself can comfortably keep pace. Even an industry this ancient, it turns out, is not exempt from having to reckon honestly with its modern cost. In response to these mounting concerns, a countercurrent slowly began to emerge within the modern textile world, one that looked, in some ways, back toward much older values this very story has traced from its beginning. Movements towards sustainable and ethically sourced textiles, natural dyes reminiscent of ancient plant-based techniques, and slower, more intentional fashion consumption began gaining genuine attention among both consumers and some manufacturers by the early 21st century. The tension is that such movements remain, for now, a genuinely smaller current within a much larger industry, still oriented primarily around speed and low cost. a tension this story cannot honestly resolve, only observe. Perhaps it is fitting that an industry built, at its very origin, on patience is now quietly being asked to remember that patience once more. Modern wool, though no longer at the absolute center of global fashion the way it once was for medieval Flanders or Renaissance Florence, has found renewed appreciation among certain buyers precisely because of the qualities that first made it valuable thousands of years ago. Natural fibers, including wool, have seen a modest resurgence in interest among consumers, drawn to durability, biodegradability, and craftsmanship, values that echo, in updated modern language, exactly what ancient spinners and medieval weavers understood instinctively about the fiber they worked with every single day. The tension, softened almost entirely into something closer to hope, is that an industry capable of moving as fast as modern fashion now moves might yet find room to remember the slower, sturdier values that once defined its very earliest chapters. This is what makes wool's long story so quietly comforting to end on. Some things, however far fashion may wander, still eventually find their way back. Today, the global textile industry, spanning cotton fields, wool farms, synthetic fiber plants, dye houses, and garment factories scattered across nearly every continent, represents one of the largest and most economically significant industries on the entire planet. Millions of people across the world still earn their livelihoods from some stage of textile production, from farmers tending sheep and cotton fields to workers operating enormous industrial looms, in an unbroken, if dramatically transformed, continuation of work that began with a single spindle turning in someone's Neolithic hand. The tension, at this late point in the story, has quietly dissolved into simple continuity. The fundamental human need to turn raw fiber into cloth and cloth into livelihood has never once disappeared, only changed its shape across 10,000 patient years. Somewhere tonight, on the very other side of the world, a loom is still quietly turning, carrying forward a chain of labor and trade that stretches back farther than almost any other human industry. The English language itself still carries quiet fossils of the wool trade, phrases so worn into everyday speech that most people using them have long forgotten their origin. Expressions like spinning a yarn, on tenterhooks, or dyed in the wool, all trace back directly to the physical processes of medieval and early modern cloth making, tentering frames that stretched drying fabric taut, or dye baths that colored wool so thoroughly the shade never faded. The tension, if it can even be called that here, is simply how easily language outlives the industries that first shaped it, carrying meaning forward long after the original context has quietly slipped away. Even now, centuries later, ordinary conversation still occasionally walks, unknowingly, through a medieval weaver's workshop. Museums across former wool and textile centers, from English market towns to Flemish cloth halls to Florentine guild buildings, now preserve looms, spindles, and dye vats that once powered entire regional economies. Visitors to these preserved spaces can see, firsthand, the modest tools, a simple spindle whorl, a wooden loom, a dyer's vat, that quietly built some of history's greatest fortunes and financed some of its most celebrated art and architecture. The tension, gentle and almost wistful, is the contrast between the humble scale of these tools and the genuinely enormous economic and cultural weight they once carried. It is a quiet, grounding reminder that history's largest transformations have so often begun with the smallest, most ordinary instruments. Family names across many European cultures still echo the textile trade's deep historical footprint. Surnames like Weaver, Webster, Fuller, Dyer, and Tucker preserving, generation after generation, the specific craft an ancestor once practiced for a living. These surnames, so common today that few who carry them ever think twice about their origin, represent a kind of quiet, accidental record of medieval economic life, embedded permanently into family identity long after the original trade itself faded from daily practice. The tension is simply the passage of time made visible. An economy built on spinning wheels and dye vats left its mark not in monuments alone, but in the very names people still answer to today. Somewhere, right now, someone introduces themselves by a surname that was once, quite literally, their family's job title. Reflecting on the full arc of this story, from a single sheared sheep in ancient Anatolia to container ships carrying synthetic cloth across modern oceans, a certain pattern emerges again and again, patient and unmistakable. Fiber becomes thread, thread becomes cloth, cloth becomes wealth, and wealth, again and again throughout this story, reshapes the societies that produce it. Their politics, their cities, their art, and occasionally, their deepest moral failures as well. The tension, if this whole sprawling story can be reduced to just one, is the same tension that has quietly run beneath nearly every single segment tonight. The gap between the humble, patient labor that creates value and the far less even distribution of who ultimately profits from it. This is what makes the history of cloth so hauntingly, endlessly human. It is, at its core, simply the story of who does the work and who, in the end, gets to keep the reward. Imagine, one final time, a long, unbroken line stretching from a Neolithic spinner twisting fiber by firelight to a modern textile worker operating an automated loom on the other side of the world tonight. Between them lie 10,000 years of shepherds and dyers, merchant guilds and banking houses, wool taxes and cotton fields, quiet fortunes and quiet suffering, each generation adding its own thread to a story none of them could see in full. The tension, softened at last into something closer to peace, is simply the size of the story itself, too vast for any single person within it to have ever fully understood what they were part of. And yet, somehow, across all that time, the thread never once broke. Trade routes rose and fell throughout this story. Bronze Age caravans, Roman roads, Silk Road oases, Hanseatic sea lanes, and modern container shipping lanes, each one, in its own era, the fastest and safest way known to move cloth from the hands that made it to the hands that wanted it. Every generation believed, quite reasonably, that its own trade networks represented the natural limit of what was possible, only for the next generation to quietly build something faster, wider, and more interconnected still. The tension is a humbling one to sit with tonight. Even our own modern global trade networks, which feel so vast and permanent, are almost certainly just one more chapter in a story that will keep extending long after tonight's story ends. No trade route in this entire history, however dominant it once felt, was ever truly the final one. Financial innovation, too, threaded its way through every era of this story, from Sumerian clay tablets tracking wool, to Florentine bills of exchange, to modern global banking systems that still, in their own way, exist to solve exactly the same ancient problem. At its heart, that problem never really changed across 10,000 years. How do you let two people who do not fully trust each other and may never meet safely exchange something valuable across distance and time? The tension is that every solution humanity has invented, clay records, bills of exchange, modern contracts, has been imperfect in its own particular way, each generation's fix eventually revealing new gaps that the next generation had to quietly patch. Finance, seen this way, is simply trust, patiently re-engineered again and again across each new era's particular fears. Labor, too, ran as a constant undercurrent through this entire story, from unnamed Sumerian temple weavers to enslaved cotton laborers to modern garment workers whose names rarely appear on the clothing labels they helped produce. Across nearly every era this story has visited tonight, the people whose hands actually created textile wealth were, more often than not, among the least visible and least rewarded participants in the entire system that depended on them. The tension, honest and unresolved even now, is that this imbalance has never fully disappeared, only changed its particular shape from one century to the next. It feels right, before this story closes, to hold that quiet imbalance gently in mind, rather than let it simply fade beneath the beauty of everything else this history has produced. And yet, alongside every difficult chapter, this story has also been, again and again, a story of genuine human ingenuity. The invention of the spindle, the discovery of dye, the mechanized loom, the bill of exchange, each one a small, patient triumph of human problem-solving across 10,000 years. From a single twisted thread to a global industry spanning every inhabited continent, humanity's relationship with fiber and cloth stands as one of the longest continuous threads of innovation in our entire shared history. The tension, by this point, has settled into something closer to quiet admiration. Very few human endeavors have been practiced this continuously, this widely, and this patiently across so many different cultures and centuries. This is what makes the whole sweep of textile history so quietly moving. It is, in the truest sense, one of humanity's oldest shared conversations, still being spoken today. Every civilization this story has visited tonight, Sumerian, Egyptian, Roman, Byzantine, Flemish, English, Florentine, Hanseatic, and the vast interconnected modern world that grew from all of them, approached cloth slightly differently, and yet all of them, without exception, understood instinctively that fiber could become fortune. That instinct, so simple and so universal, connects a Neolithic herder in ancient Anatolia to a modern factory worker on the other side of the globe far more directly than either of them could ever have imagined. The tension has, by now, gently dissolved into something closer to wonder. Across 10,000 years and every corner of an entire inhabited planet, human beings kept discovering, again and again, independently, the very same quiet truth about thread. Wool, cotton, silk, linen, and even the synthetic fibers of the modern age. Different fibers, different centuries, and always, underneath it all, the very same patient human story. As this long story draws toward its close, it is worth remembering that every single bolt of cloth ever produced, from the coarsest ancient wool to the finest Florentine silk, began exactly the same way, as raw, shapeless fiber, waiting patiently for careful hands to give it form. That transformation, fiber into thread, thread into cloth, cloth into value, required nothing more exotic than patience, skill, and time, the very same simple ingredients available to every single generation this story has visited tonight. The tension, gentle now, is simply that patience itself has grown rarer in a world that moves as quickly as ours now does, even as the deep human need for it, quietly, has never really gone away. Perhaps that is the softest lesson this long, sprawling history has to offer, on a night meant for rest rather than urgency. Somewhere right now, sheep graze quietly on hillsides in England, Australia, and countless other corners of the world, their wool growing slowly and steadily, entirely unaware of the 10,000-year economic story their fiber continues to be part of. Somewhere else, cotton bolls open in warm fields. Synthetic fibers spool through automated machines, and dye vats, descended in spirit from ancient woad and crushed insects. Color cloth bound for markets on every inhabited continent. The tension at this final point in the story has softened completely into something closer to stillness. The same ancient rhythm, fiber becoming thread, becoming cloth, becoming value, simply continues tonight, exactly as it has continued every single night for 10,000 years before this one. And somewhere, quietly, that rhythm will continue tomorrow night too, long after this story and this listener have both drifted off to sleep. Far to the east of Flanders and Florence, the Ottoman Empire built its own extraordinary textile economy, centered on cities like Bursa, which became renowned across the wider world for exceptional silk and velvet production. Ottoman weavers developed distinctive patterns and techniques that blended Byzantine, Persian, and Central Asian influences into a style recognized and sought after from European courts to markets deep in Asia, making Ottoman textiles a genuine cultural and commercial force in their own right. The tension is one familiar throughout this entire story. Ottoman authorities, much like their Byzantine predecessors, carefully regulated their most prestigious textile production, reserving certain fabrics for the Sultan's court and closely guarding the techniques that made them so distinctive. Even at the crossroads of 3 continents, the same quiet pattern held true. The finest cloth was rarely left entirely free to trade without careful royal attention. Before European trading companies ever arrived in force, an enormous and sophisticated cotton trade already connected India to markets across the Indian Ocean, from East Africa to Southeast Asia, built entirely by regional merchants long before any Western ship appeared on the horizon. Indian cotton cloth, prized for its fine weave and vivid, durable dyes, functioned almost like a currency in some Indian Ocean trading networks, exchanged for spices, gold, and other goods across a vast maritime web that had existed for centuries before European involvement. The tension is that this thriving, independent trading world was later reshaped and in significant ways diminished, once European trading companies gained increasing control over Indian textile exports during the colonial period. A trade network built patiently over centuries by regional merchants was, in time, redirected to serve interests far from where the cloth itself was ever made. In isolated early modern Japan, a nation that deliberately restricted most foreign trade for well over 2 centuries, textiles still found a narrow, carefully controlled path to reach the wider world. Through a single, closely regulated trading post, Japanese silk and other goods reached Dutch merchants, one of the only foreign traders permitted limited access during this long period of deliberate national isolation, offering a rare, narrow window connecting Japan's textile economy to the wider global trading world. The tension is a genuinely unusual one within this story. An entire nation deliberately chose to limit its own participation in expanding global textile trade, prioritizing internal stability and control over the commercial opportunities other regions eagerly pursued. Not every civilization in this story measured the value of open trade the same way, and Japan's quiet restraint stands as a fascinating exception worth remembering. Cloth itself frequently served as a form of collateral in early lending arrangements across many different centuries and cultures, its tangible, storable value making it a genuinely practical asset for securing a loan. A merchant or weaver short on ready coin could pledge stored bolts of finished cloth against borrowed money, trusting that the fabric's steady, well-understood market value would satisfy a lender should repayment ever fall through. The tension is that cloth, unlike gold or land, still carried real risk as collateral. Fire, moisture, or simply changing fashion could quietly erode its value while a loan remained outstanding. Even as a form of security, cloth carried within it the same quiet vulnerability that had shadowed it since its very earliest days as a form of ancient currency. As European stock exchanges began to formalize during the early modern period, particularly in trading centers like Amsterdam, shares in textile and trading companies were counted among the very first financial instruments publicly bought and sold. Investors could purchase a stake in a merchant venture without personally sailing a single mile or touching a single bolt of cloth, spreading the risk of long-distance textile trade across many shareholders rather than leaving it concentrated on one merchant's shoulders alone. The tension is that this innovation, while genuinely spreading risk more broadly, also introduced entirely new forms of financial speculation, as shares themselves began to be bought and sold based on rumor and expectation as much as on the actual cloth and cargo underneath them. Even the earliest stock markets, it turns out, learned quickly that paper value and physical cloth do not always move in perfect step with one another. During the American colonial period, homespun cloth became far more than a simple practical necessity. It grew into a genuine political statement, as colonists increasingly wove their own fabric rather than purchase imported British textiles. Boycotts of British cloth, organized in protest of unpopular taxes and trade policies, encouraged colonial households to return to hand spinning and weaving, transforming an ordinary domestic task into a visible, deliberate act of economic and political resistance. The tension is a fascinating echo of this story's very earliest chapters. Once again, control over cloth production became a form of genuine power, this time wielded quietly by households choosing, deliberately, not to buy. Thread, across this entire long history, has proven itself capable of carrying meaning far beyond simple warmth or fashion. Textile trade disputes and tariffs have continued to shape international relations well into the modern era, an echo of English wool taxes and staple regulations that stretches, largely unbroken, across many centuries of history. Modern trade agreements still regularly include specific provisions addressing textile and clothing imports, a persistent reminder that cloth, even now, remains sensitive and significant enough to warrant careful, deliberate negotiation between nations protecting their own domestic industries. The tension, seen across the full span of this story, is really no different from the tension that once shaped medieval wool politics. Nations, ancient and modern alike, have always sought to protect industries that support significant employment and national identity. Some economic instincts, it seems, remain remarkably steady across even 10,000 years of change. If there is a single thread that runs unbroken through every single century this story has visited tonight, it may simply be this: human beings have never stopped needing to cover their bodies, and have never stopped finding clever, patient, and sometimes difficult ways to meet that need at scale. From a single spindle whorl in a Neolithic village to an automated loom running quietly tonight on the other side of the world, the underlying human need driving this entire 10,000-year story has genuinely never once changed. The tension, softened now into something closer to gratitude, is simply how much quiet human effort, across so many generations, has gone into meeting something as basic as the need to be clothed. It is worth falling asleep tonight with that thought held gently in mind. How much patient history is woven into something as ordinary as the fabric resting against your own skin right now. Long before written treaties carried the full weight of diplomacy, finely woven cloth often traveled between rulers as a carefully chosen gift, a soft, wordless way of signaling respect, wealth, and goodwill between distant courts. Silk, fine wool, and richly dyed textiles were frequently exchanged as diplomatic gifts across many different eras and cultures, their quality and rarity speaking, without a single word, to the sender's wealth and the value they placed on the relationship being built. The tension is that such gifts carried real expectation along with their beauty. A ruler who received fine cloth was understood, quietly but clearly, to owe some form of goodwill or reciprocity in return. Even diplomacy, in this long story, so often found its gentlest, most persuasive language woven directly into thread. Tapestries, woven rather than painted, became one of the medieval and early modern world's most prized art forms, transforming castle and cathedral walls into enormous, patiently worked scenes of history, myth, and daily life. Producing a single large tapestry could require a skilled workshop, months or even years of labor, coordinating dozens of weavers working from detailed painted designs to recreate scenes in extraordinary woven detail using dyed wool and silk thread. The tension is the same patient one that has echoed throughout this entire story. Extraordinary beauty, in nearly every century this tale has visited, required an extraordinary, often invisible investment of careful human time. Some of history's grandest artistic achievements, seen closely enough, are really just thread, patiently multiplied by thousands of careful, unhurried hours. Across many cultures and centuries, a woven textile dowry represented far more than simple decoration for a new household. It often constituted genuine, transferable family wealth, carefully accumulated and woven by hand over years in preparation for marriage. Families across regions as varied as rural Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia traditionally prepared woven textiles, blankets, linens, and clothing as part of a bride's dowry, representing tangible economic security she would carry directly into her new household. The tension is that this tradition placed enormous, often uncompensated labor expectations specifically on young women, who might spend years quietly weaving and embroidering pieces meant to demonstrate both skill and the value they brought into a marriage. Even love and marriage, across much of this long history, carried within them a quiet undercurrent of careful economic calculation. Sheep and wool found their way deeply into folklore, proverb, and religious symbolism across countless cultures, a reflection of just how central these humble animals were to daily economic and spiritual life alike. From shepherding imagery in religious texts to folk tales warning against wolves among the flock, wool-bearing sheep became a recurring, deeply familiar symbol of vulnerability, provision, and careful stewardship across cultures that depended on them for survival and trade alike. The tension, gentle as it is, reflects something quietly beautiful about how thoroughly an economic necessity can become woven into a culture's deepest stories and beliefs. A creature valued first for its fleece became, over centuries, valued just as deeply for what it seemed to represent about trust, care, and quiet provision. The story of wool and textiles, traced across this entire long night, ultimately reveals something larger than the history of any single fiber, trade route, or economic system. It reveals a pattern repeated in nearly every era humanity has built, a simple, patient human skill, spinning fiber into thread, growing gradually into guilds, into cities, into banking systems, into empires, and eventually into the vast interconnected global economy that clothes the entire world today. The tension at this final resting point in the story has softened entirely into quiet appreciation. Very few threads in human history stretch this far, connecting a Neolithic spindle so directly and unbroken to a modern factory loom still turning somewhere tonight. This is what makes the history of wool and textiles so hauntingly, quietly remarkable. An ordinary fiber, patiently worked, has clothed and financed nearly the entire span of human civilization. As this story settles toward its final rest, imagine one last time the full unbroken chain it has traced tonight. Sheep grazing on ancient Anatolian hills, Sumerian scribes counting wool on damp clay, Egyptian linen wrapped carefully in desert tombs, Roman cloaks dyed in costly purple, Byzantine silk guarded behind palace walls. Imagine Flemish weavers bent over their looms in narrow stone houses, English wool sacks crossing the channel toward hungry continental markets, Florentine bankers turning cloth profits into the patronage that built the Renaissance, and Hanseatic ships braving cold northern seas laden with bundled fabric. Imagine cotton fields under a harsh, unforgiving sun, steam-powered mills rising in industrial cities, and finally, tonight, somewhere on the other side of the world, a quiet, automated loom still turning, carrying this same ancient thread forward into tomorrow. 10,000 years, and the thread, remarkably, has never once broken. There is something quietly fitting about ending a story this long on the subject of rest, since cloth itself has always been there, waiting patiently at the very edge of sleep. Blankets woven from wool, sheets spun from linen or cotton, the simple fabric gathered gently around a tired body at the close of a long day. These are, in their own quiet way, some of the oldest and most faithful companions human comfort has ever known. The tension, if it can even be called that this close to sleep, is simply the quiet awareness of how much unseen history rests, right now, in something as ordinary as the covers settling gently over you. 10,000 years of shepherds, spinners, weavers, merchants, and bankers, quietly folded into the soft, unremarkable comfort of a single warm blanket. And so tonight's thread, spun from a single sheared sheep on an ancient hillside, carried through temples and trade roads, guild halls and banking houses, cotton fields and steam-powered mills, finally settles here, gently, beside you. Every fiber this story has followed tonight was, in the end, simply patience made visible. Patience to grow it, patience to spin it, patience to weave it, and patience, quietly, to carry its value forward across generations who would never meet each other. The tension has, by now, fully dissolved, leaving only a kind of soft, settled stillness behind it. Let that patience, borrowed gently from 10,000 years of careful hands, settle now over you as well. Consider, for a moment, how strange and quietly wonderful it is that a single biological accident, a wild sheep's undercoat growing soft enough to spin, ever set 10,000 years of this history into motion at all. Nothing about that first tuft of fiber announced the empires it would help finance, the art it would help fund, the wars it would help pay for, or the ordinary comfort it would eventually bring to nearly every household on Earth. The tension, gentle and almost philosophical at this late hour, is simply how rarely history's largest transformations begin with any sense of their own future scale. A quiet, unremarkable beginning, followed patiently across generations, is very often exactly how the largest stories in economic history have always started. Tonight's story could easily have followed cotton instead of wool, or silk instead of linen, or any of a dozen other fibers this same patient human instinct eventually turned to thread and cloth across different corners of the world. Each fiber carries its own particular history, its own particular geography, its own particular mix of triumph and hardship, and yet every single one, without exception, follows roughly the same deep pattern this story has traced tonight. Patient labor, slowly gathered value, and the uneven, very human question of who ultimately benefits from it. The tension softens, one final time, into something closer to recognition, whichever fiber a listener's own ancestors happened to work with. The underlying story being told was almost certainly the very same one. Thread, in the end, has always been thread, however differently each corner of the world chose to spin it. There is a certain comfort in knowing that whatever fabric happens to be resting against you right now, whether wool, cotton, linen, or something spun entirely from modern chemistry, carries a little of every chapter this story has walked through tonight. Somewhere in its quiet history are Neolithic spindles, Sumerian ledgers, Egyptian tombs, Roman roads, Byzantine palaces, Flemish looms, English pastures, Florentine banks, Hanseatic ships, cotton fields, and steam-driven mills, folded together into something ordinary enough to simply sleep beneath without a second thought. The tension at this final hour has fully given way to something soft and settled. Let that quiet, 10,000-year thread be the very last thing your mind follows tonight, gently, all the way down into sleep. We began tonight beside a single sheared sheep on a hillside in ancient Anatolia, and from there the thread carried us through Sumerian clay tablets counting wool, through Egyptian linen wound tightly around the quiet dead, through Roman purple reserved only for emperors. We followed it through Byzantine silk guarded behind palace walls, along the long, patient silk road, into the damp weaving houses of Flanders, across the English wool sacks that financed a kingdom, and into the banking halls of Florence where cloth profits quietly funded the Renaissance itself. We sailed with Hanseatic ships across cold northern seas, walked among enclosed English pastures where sheep replaced entire farming villages, and paused honestly, gently, beside the difficult chapters this story could not look away from: forced cotton labor, displaced families, unnamed spinners whose hands built fortunes they never shared in. And we followed the thread forward still, through steam-powered mills, through synthetic fibers born from chemistry rather than soil, all the way to a quiet loom turning somewhere on the other side of the world at this very moment. If you are still awake, there is another slow story waiting for you on this channel whenever you would like to drift into it. Another quiet corner of economic history, ready to be gently explored. If tonight's story helped you settle, consider leaving a soft like on your way out, subscribing for the next slow journey through history, or leaving a comment about which thread you would like followed next time. There is never any rush, and it helps more than you might think. For now, let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders sink a little further into stillness. Let each breath grow longer and slower than the one before it. Picture soft light fading gently across a quiet room, the last hush of evening settling like fine wool over everything it touches, the whole world outside slowly dimming into rest. Sleep well and good night.